The moment still plays in my head like a bruise that never faded. My husband Kendall stepped back from the microphones, looked straight past me, and said, "I don't know her." Not "I'm sorry." Not "this isn't the time." Just that. Flat. Clean. Final. We were standing on the courthouse steps, where the campaign had staged a press event big enough to feel like a parade. Cameras. Donors. Volunteers in matching jackets. I had come straight from work, still wearing flats, still holding the folder I'd brought him the night before. I thought I was early support. I didn't know I was about to be erased. A reporter pointed at me and asked who I was. My husband didn't hesitate. He shifted his smile, tightened his jaw, and denied knowing me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong scene. Security moved in. Someone grabbed my elbow. Another voice asked how I got past the barricade. Online, I later learned, people would call me unhinged. Desperate. A protester. A woman trying to attach herself to a rising man. I stood there, frozen, watching donors avert their eyes and staffers pretend not to recognize me. I searched his face for a flicker of regret. There was none. Just calculation. That night, while the clip looped on every local station, separation papers appeared in my email, and signed scans, already prepared. He had planned this. Not the cameras. Not the timing. But the exit. He thought I was a liability. An educated wife who asked questions. A voice that didn't fit the story he was selling. What he didn't remember, what he never imagined I'd use, was that I had sat in rooms he forgot about. Heard promises he assumed I'd dismiss. Names. Numbers. Favors traded quietly, off the record. As I watched strangers decide who I was based on 10 seconds of footage, something in me went still. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to let the truth speak, on my terms. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before any cameras showed up, before my face became a headline, my life was quiet in a way that felt earned. Kendall Whitner and I, Yasmin Whitner, lived just outside downtown Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in a narrow brick townhouse that always smelled like coffee and printer ink. Campaign flyers stacked on one side of the dining table. My work laptop on the other. We used to joke that our marriage ran on deadlines. I believed in what he said he stood for. That mattered to me. I wasn't the kind of wife who smiled silently in the background. I read policy drafts. I asked questions. I challenged him when something didn't sit right. He used to say that was why he trusted me. In the early days, Kendall asked for my opinion constantly. How a speech sounded. Which donors felt sincere. Which promises felt slippery. I had a good memory, and he knew it. I remembered names. Numbers. Who offered what, and when. The campaign slowly took over our home. Phone calls during dinner. Strategy meetings that ran late into the night. I adapted without complaint. I packed lunches. Proofread statements. Reminded him to sleep. But something shifted when the polls started climbing. New people appeared. Men in tailored suits. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I noticed how Kendall's tone changed around donors, softer, careful, practiced. When I asked questions afterward, he brushed them off. "You're reading too much into it," he told me once, not unkindly. I wanted to believe him. I told myself pressure made people distant. That this was temporary. Still, I started keeping notes, not out of suspicion, but habit. Dates. Names. Casual promises said too easily. I didn't think of it as protection. Just organization. The same way I'd always lived my life. Looking back, that was the last season when I thought love and loyalty were enough to protect me. I didn't know I was already being edited out of the picture. The first time I felt truly out of place was at a small fundraiser hosted in a restored row house near the river. The space was crowded with donors balancing wine glasses and quiet ambition. Kendall moved through the room easily, shaking hands, laughing on cue. I stayed close at first, listening the way I always had. Then I noticed how introductions changed. "This is Kendall," someone said, gesturing toward him, then pausing before looking at me. The pause lingered. Awkward. Deliberate. I waited for Kendall to fill the gap. He didn't. I stepped forward and introduced myself. Smiles followed, but they were thin. Appraising. I caught pieces of conversation that stopped short when I joined them. One man mentioned zoning approvals. Another joked about flexibility once elected. Kendall laughed, but later, when I asked what that meant, he waved it away. "Donors talk big," he said. "It's nothing." But his hand slipped from mine sooner than usual. He drifted back into the circle without me. I stood near the wall, watching his posture straighten, his voice lower. A woman beside me leaned in and whispered, "You're not on the program." I wasn't sure what she meant. I asked her to clarify, but she had already turned away. On the drive home, the silence felt heavier than the traffic. I told Kendall I felt invisible that night. Not ignored or erased. He sighed, eyes still on the road. "You can't take everything personally," he said. "This is politics." That word, politics, became his shield. Every discomfort. Every boundary crossed. Every decision I wasn't part of anymore. I looked out the window and watched the city blur past, realizing that something had changed in a way I couldn't name yet. I just knew I was standing on the outside of a door that used to be open. The next warning came quietly, disguised as concern. One evening, while Kendall was reviewing talking points on the couch, he mentioned a media prep consultant the campaign had brought on. He said it casually, like it didn't matter. "They're helping polish things," he told me. Messaging. Image. I asked what that meant for us. "For you," he corrected, not looking up. "Just, maybe less visibility for now." The words landed wrong. I sat across from him, waiting for him to explain himself better. He didn't. He finally added, "Some voters don't respond well to strong opinions at home. They like simplicity." I laughed at first, thinking he was joking. When he didn't smile back, my chest tightened. "So I'm a problem?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "You're just not the focus." That was new. For years, we'd been a unit. Now I was background noise. Over the next few weeks, the adjustments piled up. Invitations addressed only to Kendall. Schedule changes I wasn't told about. Photos from events where he stood alone, framed just right. I noticed a campaign post online praising his total devotion to public service. No mention of family. No mention of me. When I asked about it, he shrugged. Voters don't care about personal details. That night, I opened a folder on my laptop and started saving screenshots. Posts. Emails. Donor invites. It wasn't anger that drove me. It was instinct. If something was being rewritten, I wanted a record of the original. I didn't confront him again right away. I watched instead. Listened. Noted which names came up more often. Which promises sounded rehearsed. He still came home. Still slept beside me. But there was a growing space between us, one filled with calculation and silence. I hadn't been pushed out yet. But I could feel the pressure building, steady and deliberate, like hands on my back guiding me toward the edge. I finally said something the night Samira came over for dinner. Samira Lockwood had been my friend long before the campaign, back when conversations were about work and books instead of polling numbers. She noticed things quickly. Always had. Halfway through the meal, she leaned back in her chair and looked between Kendall and me. "You two feel different," she said carefully. Kendall smiled without warmth. "Busy season." Samira nodded, but her eyes stayed on me. After Kendall stepped into the kitchen to take a call, she lowered her voice. "You okay?" she asked. I hesitated. Then I told her the truth, or at least the version I was ready to admit. The skipped introductions. The missing invitations. The way I felt managed. Samira didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "That's not accidental." Kendall returned before I could respond. The rest of dinner stayed polite. Surface level. Safe. Later that night, once Samira left, Kendall confronted me in the hallway. "You didn't need to air our business," he said. "I answered a question," I replied. He rubbed his temples like I was exhausting him. "This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes a debate with you." I stared at him, trying to recognize the man I'd married. Since when is honesty a liability? He didn't answer that. He just said, "You need to trust me." But trust had started to feel like a one-way street. The next morning, I found a draft schedule on the printer, an upcoming rally listed as candidate only. No spouses. No family. I stood there longer than I needed to, reading it again and again. It wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was planning. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind that Kendall wasn't just adapting to politics. He was choosing it. And I wasn't sure there was room for both of us in the version of his life he was building. The rally invitation arrived 3 days later, addressed to Kendall alone. It was printed on thick paper, embossed with the campaign logo, the kind meant to feel important. I held it between my fingers, waiting for my name to appear somewhere else. It didn't. When I asked him about it, Kendall barely looked up from his phone. "It's just logistics," he said. "Space is tight." I reminded him it was being held in a public square. He exhaled slowly, the way he did when he wanted the conversation to end. "You don't need to be at everything." That sentence settled into my chest and stayed there. Later that afternoon, Renee Silverton stopped by. She and I had met through work years ago, and over time she'd become someone I trusted, direct, observant, impossible to distract with excuses. She glanced at the invitation on the counter and raised an eyebrow. "That's odd." I told her what Kendall had said. She didn't soften her response. "That's not crowd control," Renee said. "That's message control." She asked if I'd noticed any paperwork changes. Legal notices. New accounts. Anything that felt rushed or quiet. I thought about the emails Kendall took in the other room. The documents he closed when I walked by. The way he'd stopped syncing calendars with me. That night, after he fell asleep, I checked the shared cloud folder we used for household documents. Most of it was the same. But one folder was missing. Not deleted. Just gone. I didn't wake him. I didn't confront him. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark screen, feeling something cold and steady replace the confusion. This wasn't about space. This was about preparation. And for the first time, I understood that whatever was coming next had already been decided, just not with me in the room. I started paying attention in a different way after that. Not the hopeful kind. The careful kind. Kendall's routine changed. He left earlier. Came home later. When he did come back, he was wired, restless, always checking his phone. If I asked where he'd been, the answers stayed vague. Meetings, he'd say. Strategy. I stopped pushing. Instead, I listened. One evening, while he showered, his phone buzzed on the dresser. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The notification banner was enough. Attorney Tremaine Ashcrofton, revised documents attached. My stomach tightened. We didn't have a lawyer. At least, not one I knew about. Later, I asked casually if the campaign had legal counsel now. Kendall nodded too quickly. Standard stuff, he said. Nothing you need to worry about. That phrase again. I opened my notebook that night and wrote Tremaine's name at the top of a page. Under it, a date. No conclusions. Just facts. A week later, a donor dinner ran late. Kendall texted that he'd be staying downtown. When he came home the next morning, his jacket smelled like hotel soap. I didn't comment. I added another note. I also noticed how often Orlando Kingsbridge's name came up, usually followed by silence. Conversations cut short. Calls taken outside. Once, I heard Kendall say, "She won't be involved." I didn't hear who she was. The house felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in. I slept lightly, mind racing through possibilities I wasn't ready to name. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being excluded with intention. And exclusion, I was learning, always left a paper trail, if you were patient enough to look for it. I just didn't know yet how far he'd already gone. The first proof didn't come from Kendall. It came from the mail. A thick envelope sat on the hall table one afternoon, wedged between grocery flyers and campaign postcards. No return address. Just my name typed cleanly across the front. Inside was a copy of a filing notice. Not finalized. Not signed. But unmistakable. A petition for legal separation. I read it once. Then again. My hand stayed steady, which surprised me. What shook me was the date. It had been drafted weeks earlier, before the fundraiser. Before the rally invitation. Before the cameras. I checked the footer. Tremaine's name appeared there too. When Kendall came home, I didn't confront him right away. I asked how his day was. He kissed my cheek. He talked about polling numbers and turnout projections like nothing was wrong. I waited until after dinner. "Why am I finding drafts of separation papers in the mail?" I asked. His face didn't go pale. It hardened. "They're just contingencies," he said. "Nothing filed." "Contingencies for what?" I asked. "For optics," he replied. "If things get complicated." I stared at him. "I'm your wife." He didn't argue that. He just said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." That was the moment something broke cleanly instead of painfully. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't conflicted. He was prepared. Later that night, I photographed every page of the notice. Saved it in 3 places. Labeled the file with the date it was created, not the date I received it. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was documenting. And deep down, I understood something else too. If he'd planned this quietly, he'd underestimated how much of his world I already knew. That miscalculation would matter later. The next week, I attended the rally anyway. It was staged on the courthouse steps downtown, framed as a public square event. Music, volunteers, banners, close enough to government that it felt official. Not as a protester. Not as a disruption. As a wife who still lived in her own life. The square was already packed when I arrived. Volunteers handed out signs. Music played through cheap speakers. I stood near the edge, blending in, watching Kendall move across the stage with practiced confidence. He looked comfortable up there. Grounded. Like the version of himself that no longer needed me. When his speech ended, reporters surged forward. Questions flew. I stepped closer without thinking. Not to interrupt. Just to stand where I'd always stood. A reporter noticed me and asked, "Are you Kendall Cuttin Fast?" I don't know her. The words hit harder in person than they ever did on replay. Not because they were loud, but because they were precise. Chosen. Security closed in. Hands on my arms. People stared. Some whispered. Others pulled out phones. I caught Kendall's eye once. Just once. There was no apology there. Only urgency. Like I was a fire he needed extinguished before it spread. They escorted me out as cameras followed. Online, within minutes, I was being labeled. A plant. A threat. A distraction. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Messages from strangers. From old acquaintances. From people asking if I was okay, or asking who I really was. That night, separation papers hit my email. Official this time. No explanation. No conversation. I sat at the kitchen table, replaying the clip on mute, watching his mouth form the words again and again. Something settled inside me. He had erased me publicly. Which meant whatever came next would also be public. And for the first time since this began, I felt calm, not because I'd lost everything, but because I finally knew exactly where the line was. He'd crossed it. And he'd done it in front of witnesses. The days after the rally blurred together in a way that felt unreal. The clip spread faster than I could track it. Local news first. Then national commentary accounts. Then strangers stitching my face into their arguments. I stopped reading after the first hour. I didn't need to know what they thought. What I needed was clarity. Samira came over with groceries I hadn't asked for. She didn't say much at first. Just sat with me while I drank coffee I couldn't taste. Finally, she said, "This wasn't a mistake." I nodded. Saying it out loud made it heavier, but also sharper. Renee joined us later that evening. She brought her laptop and a calm I envied. She'd already pulled the public filings on Kendall's campaign. "There are gaps," she said. "Reporting delays. Donations routed through intermediaries." I told them what I knew. The rooms I'd been in. The promises I'd overheard. Zoning approvals mentioned casually. Access offered quietly. Renee looked at me carefully. "Did you keep records?" I opened my laptop and showed them the folder. Screenshots. Notes. Dates. Names. Samira exhaled slowly. "He thought you were invisible." That night, a statement from the campaign hit social media. It framed the incident as a security lapse. An unknown individual. No mention of marriage. No denial either. That silence was deliberate. I forwarded the statement to a new email thread and added one name to it, Janae Meadowbrook. She was a journalist I'd crossed paths with years ago. Careful. Patient. Known for following money longer than most people followed outrage. I didn't tell her everything. Just enough to signal that I wasn't guessing. I hit send and closed the laptop. The humiliation had already happened. What came next would be intentional. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedure. I was served the papers on a Tuesday morning. A process server waited outside the townhouse, polite and efficient, like this was just another task on a list. Legal separation. Temporary orders. A request for exclusive use of the residence. I read the pages slowly. My name everywhere. My signature nowhere. Kendall had moved fast. Faster than I believed possible. When I called him, he didn't answer. When I texted, the message stayed unread. That was when it became clear this wasn't damage control. It was removal. By afternoon, the campaign released another statement. This one framed Kendall as a private man under public pressure. It suggested he'd been targeted. That his family's situation was being handled legally. I was no longer a person in their story. I was a complication being processed. I packed a bag that evening. Not because I was told to leave, but because I refused to wait for permission. Before I zipped it closed, I added my notebook. The screenshots. The separation draft. Every small detail I'd collected without realizing why. As I walked out, I looked back at the house, the campaign flyers still stacked on the table, the coffee mugs in the sink. That life was over. But something else was beginning. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't hoping for an apology or clarity. I was done being erased. Whatever Kendall had built by pretending I didn't exist, I was about to show exactly how much of it rested on my silence. And I had decided, very calmly, that my silence was no longer available. The first thing I did after leaving the house was stop trying to explain myself. No statements. No posts. No rebuttals. Silence, I learned quickly, made people nervous. I stayed with Samira for a few days, sleeping on her couch, waking up before sunrise with my mind already racing. Every instinct told me to react, to correct the story that had been built around me. I forced myself not to. Instead, I organized. I spread everything out across Samira's dining table, my notebook, printed screenshots, donor invitations, email timestamps. I rebuilt the timeline from the beginning, slower this time. More deliberate. Patterns emerged when I stopped rushing. Names repeated. Promises followed appearances. Donations landed just days before key meetings. I highlighted anything that connected money to access, even indirectly. Renee joined us that afternoon. She didn't comment at first. Just watched. "This isn't gossip," she finally said. "This is structure." She helped me separate what I knew from what I could prove. That distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. I drafted a clean summary, no emotion, no accusations. Just facts, dates, and context. Then I sent it to Tremaine Ashcrofton. Not as a threat. As a notice. I wrote one sentence in the email body: "Please confirm whether these documents were prepared with full spousal disclosure." That was it. No anger. No pleading. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Not a response, just a read receipt. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled for the first time in days. This wasn't revenge yet. This was footing. And for the first time since Kendall said he didn't know me, I felt something shift, not in him, but in me. I wasn't chasing the truth anymore. I was positioning it. The next obstacle came from the place I expected, at least, procedure. 2 days after my email to Tremaine, a formal response arrived. Polite. Neutral. Carefully empty. He confirmed the documents had been prepared at the direction of the client. He declined to answer anything else without authorization. No denial. No correction. Just a wall. Renee read it once and nodded. That's not a no. That's a delay. Delays were familiar territory by now. Samira suggested I take a walk, clear my head. Instead, I went back through my notes and focused on one donor name that kept resurfacing: Alonzo Goldcrest. He appeared early. Often. Always near conversations about zoning and development. I remembered a dinner where Kendall had leaned in and said, "We'll take care of that after the primary." At the time, I'd thought it was campaign talk. Now it felt heavier. I searched public records. Not deeply, just enough to see where Goldcrest's interests were anchored. Real estate. Permits. Pending appeals. The timeline tightened. Still, memory wasn't evidence. So I reached out carefully. Not to Alonzo. To someone adjacent, a former aide who'd left the campaign months earlier. I framed it as clarification, not confrontation. The reply took a full day. When it came, it was cautious. Non-committal. But one line stood out: some conversations weren't meant to be documented. That was confirmation of intent, if not proof. I saved the message. Labeled it partial. This was the friction I'd been warned about. Doors that didn't slam shut, just stayed closed long enough to make you doubt yourself. I didn't doubt myself. I adjusted. Instead of forcing access, I widened the lens, looking not just at what was promised, but at who had been present when promises were made. Witnesses didn't need permission to remember. They just needed the right question. The first person who agreed to talk did it on conditions. No recordings. No names. No follow-ups. We met in a quiet cafe across the river, the kind of place where conversations blended into background noise. He arrived late, kept his jacket on, and chose a table with his back to the wall. "I can't be quoted," he said before sitting down. "I'm not asking you to be," I replied. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded. He had worked logistics for the campaign early on. Not strategy. Not messaging. He was around because he had to be. I didn't push. I asked simple questions. Dates. Locations. Who was usually in the room when donors visited after hours? He answered carefully at first. Then more freely. Goldcrest's name came up again. So did Orlando's. He confirmed what I already suspected, that some meetings were intentionally undocumented. No calendars. No notes. Just memory and mutual understanding. They knew what couldn't be written down, he said. I asked if Kendall was present. The pause was long enough to matter. Yes, he finally said. Always. That was the closest thing to proof I had so far, and it still wasn't enough. When I asked if anyone else might talk, he shook his head. Not yet. People are scared. I thanked him and didn't ask for more. Outside, the cold air felt sharper. I sat in my car and wrote everything down immediately. Time. Place. His phrasing. What he avoided saying. Renee reviewed my notes that night and circled one line. Always. That matters, she said. Presence equals knowledge. Still, presence didn't equal consequence. Not yet. But I wasn't trying to blow this open all at once. I was building pressure, layer by layer. If fear was keeping people silent, then timing, not force, would decide who spoke next. The pressure showed up before the proof did. 3 days after the cafe meeting, I received a cease and desist letter. It wasn't dramatic. No accusations. Just firm language advising me to refrain from making defamatory statements about the campaign or its donors. Tremaine's name was on it again. Renee read it twice and smiled without humor. They wouldn't bother if you were irrelevant. That was the point. I wasn't. Still, the letter did what it was meant to do, it slowed things down. People stopped returning messages. A scheduled coffee was quietly cancelled. Silence thickened around me. This was the second friction point, and it was different from the first. Not denial. Containment. Samira noticed it too. They're trying to freeze you out, she said. Make you doubt your footing. Instead of pushing outward, I turned inward. I reviewed everything connected to the separation filing. Dates. Drafts. Metadata. One detail stood out, a notarization timestamp that didn't match Kendall's public schedule that day. It placed him downtown during a donor luncheon he'd sworn he missed. I cross-checked it with photos from the event. Same suit. Same tie. Same smile. That overlap mattered. Not because it proved corruption, but because it proved lying. I forwarded the comparison, quietly, anonymously, to Janae Meadowbrook. No commentary. Just images and timestamps. An hour later, she replied with a single sentence, "Keep going." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. They could threaten me. Delay me. Isolate me. But they couldn't rewrite time. And time, once aligned, had a way of pulling truth into the open whether anyone wanted it there or not. I wasn't chasing them anymore. They were starting to react to me. The next move came from Kendall himself. Not directly. Never directly. A mutual acquaintance reached out first, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly concerned about my well-being. The message was polite, carefully worded, and unmistakably coached. It suggested I take a break from public life. That I consider how stress could affect perception. That things could resolve quietly if I stopped engaging. I didn't respond. Later that night, Kendall finally called. His voice sounded measured, almost gentle. Like we were negotiating furniture, not the wreckage of a marriage. This has gone far enough, he said. I asked him what this was. You talking to people, he replied. Creating confusion. I reminded him I hadn't said anything publicly. That I'd issued no statements. No accusations. That's not the point, he said. Your silence isn't neutral anymore. That was the closest he came to honesty. He offered mediation. A settlement. A timeline that benefited him. He framed it as protection, for both of us. You don't want this to get ugly, he said. I thought of the rally. The cameras. The way he'd erased me in a sentence. I didn't make it ugly, I said. I just stopped disappearing. There was a pause. Then his tone shifted, sharper. You don't understand how this works, he said. People get hurt. The threat wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. After we hung up, I wrote down everything. His wording. The timing. The escalation. Renee reviewed my notes and nodded. That call? That's pressure. Pressure meant proximity. And proximity meant we were closer than he realized to something he couldn't manage with optics or silence. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt ready. Because for the first time since he denied knowing me, Kendall had acknowledged something real. I was still here. The call changed the rhythm. Not in public, there, everything stayed polished. But behind the scenes, people started watching each other more closely. Messages came slower. Meetings shifted without explanation. That kind of tension leaves marks. Janae reached out again, this time with questions instead of encouragement. Specific ones. She wanted confirmation of who had been present at certain dinners. Whether Kendall had personal knowledge of donor requests, not just secondhand exposure. Whether there was any record, however informal, of follow-up conversations. I didn't speculate. I answered what I could verify and flagged what I couldn't. One name she circled was Orlando Kingsbridge. He's the hinge, she said over the phone. If he moves, everything moves. I thought about the times Orlando had cut conversations short. The way Kendall deferred to him without admitting it. I reached out to Orlando once. Just once. I kept it neutral. He responded within minutes. You need to stop. No greeting. No explanation. I forwarded the message to Renee. She didn't react immediately. Then she asked me one question. Why respond at all if you're irrelevant? That message did more than threaten. It established awareness. Knowledge. Concern. I added it to the folder. That night, Samira sat beside me on the couch and asked if I was scared. I thought about it honestly. No, I said. I'm focused. Fear had lived in uncertainty. Now I had direction. I wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. I was narrowing the field, identifying who felt exposed enough to speak without being asked. Because when power shifts, the first cracks don't come from the top. They come from the people holding it together underneath, afraid of being left alone when it falls. And something was already loosening. The first real crack came from someone who had nothing to gain by staying silent. A junior staffer reached out late one night. No introduction. Just a message asking if we could talk off the record. We met in a park after dark, sitting on opposite ends of a bench like strangers. He kept checking his phone, flinching every time it buzzed. I'm not loyal to them anymore, he said quickly. I'm loyal to my future. He told me he'd been asked to deliver envelopes, nothing labeled, nothing logged. He didn't know what was inside. He wasn't supposed to. But he remembered where they went. Goldcrest's office. Orlando's car. Once, to a law firm downtown. He couldn't prove what was exchanged, but he could confirm movement. Timing. Pattern. I don't want my name anywhere near this, he said. But I can tell you who else saw it. That was the difference. Witnesses don't need to accuse. They just need to exist. I wrote everything down as soon as I got back. Renee cross-referenced the locations with donation dates. The alignment wasn't perfect, but it was consistent enough to ask real questions. Janae reviewed the summary and paused. This is enough to publish part of the story, she said. But not the heart. We both knew what the heart was. Intent. And intent lived in conversations, not envelopes. Still, this was movement. The kind that made silence harder to maintain. As I closed my notebook that night, I realized something important. Kendall hadn't just erased me. He'd underestimated how many people had seen what he thought no one noticed. And now they were deciding which side of the record they wanted to be on when the story finally stopped changing. The escalation came disguised as mercy. A revised settlement offer arrived that morning, more generous than the last. Faster timelines. Confidentiality clauses framed as mutual protection. A condition that all communication go through Tremaine. Renee read it once and shook her head. They're trying to buy time. I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to close my mouth before something else opened. That afternoon, Janae called with urgency in her voice. They're about to move, she said. A preemptive narrative. If they control the first big explanation, everything after sounds like defense. Kendall wasn't reacting anymore. He was setting a trap. That night, a surprise press release dropped. The campaign announced Kendall would voluntarily recuse himself from certain fundraising operations due to personal distractions. It framed him as responsible, proactive, ethical. It was clean, strategic, and incomplete. Because attached to the release, quietly, almost buried, was a disclosure amendment listing donors who had already been promised follow-up meetings after the primary. Names. Dates. Categories. Not details. But enough structure to raise questions. They thought this would end it. They were wrong. Janae called back 10 minutes later. They just confirmed jurisdiction. That amendment placed Kendall directly inside the chain of decision-making he'd denied for months. It contradicted his earlier statements. It also contradicted the cease and desist. Contradictions don't scream. They echo. I didn't rush. I didn't celebrate. I forwarded the release, the amendment, and my notes, unchanged, to Janae. Let it sit, she said. Let them explain it. That was the turn. They'd escalated to control the damage. Instead, they'd drawn a clean outline around the truth. And this time, it wasn't me stepping into the spotlight. It was the story catching up to them. Once the amendment went public, the tone shifted everywhere. People who hadn't returned messages for weeks suddenly wanted clarification. Questions appeared online, framed politely but pointed enough to sting. Commentators stopped talking about the woman at the rally and started asking why a candidate needed to revise disclosures mid-campaign. That distinction mattered. Janae moved carefully. She didn't publish immediately. Instead, she requested formal comment from the campaign, attaching a list of inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, statements that contradicted filings. The response came late that night. It blamed staff. Miscommunication. Clerical oversight. I recognized the strategy. Diffuse responsibility. Protect the center. Renee shook her head when she read it. That only works once. Meanwhile, Tremaine sent another message, this time requesting a call. The tone was no longer distant. It was controlled urgency. I didn't reply. Silence had become a tool, and I wasn't giving it up cheaply. Instead, I focused on preparing for what came next. My notes into a single narrative thread, no speculation, no adjectives. Just a sequence that couldn't be rearranged without breaking. I shared it with Janae under one condition: timing would be deliberate. If you publish when it forces answers, I said. She agreed. That night, Kendall texted for the first time since the call weeks earlier. We need to talk. Privately. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Private was where this had started. Public was where it would end. I didn't respond. Because I understood something now that I hadn't before: the moment someone asks for privacy after denying you in public, it means they've lost control of the narrative. And once control slips, truth doesn't need permission anymore. It just needs light. The story broke the next morning without my name in the headline. That was intentional. Janae framed it around governance, not gossip. Donor influence. Undisclosed commitments. A pattern of access that blurred ethical lines without accusing anyone outright. Kendall's denial at the rally appeared halfway down the article, not as drama, but as context. A contradiction. One more data point. The comments were different this time. No jokes. No memes. Just questions. Why had a candidate who claimed distance from donors signed off on follow-up meetings? Why had disclosure amendments appeared only after pressure? Why did timelines keep shifting? By noon, the campaign announced an internal review. By evening, Orlando resigned. The statement called it a personal decision. No wrongdoing admitted. No explanations offered. Renee watched the news clip on mute and nodded. There it is. Orlando wasn't the center. He was the support beam. When he stepped away, everything else sagged. Tremaine emailed again, this time asking for a meeting to discuss resolution. Not settlement. Resolution. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded the resignation statement to Janae with one line attached, "This isn't the end of the chain." She replied within minutes. I know. Who's next? I thought about Goldcrest. The envelopes. The after-hours meetings. The donor luncheon that overlapped with Kendall's notarization. I sent her the name. That night, I sat alone on Samira's balcony, the city quiet below me. For the first time since the rally, I wasn't watching the news or my phone. The narrative had shifted without my voice needing to push it. That was power, not the loud kind, but the kind that holds. Kendall had denied knowing me to protect his image. Now, the image was cracking. And all I had done was stop letting the truth be rearranged. Goldcrest didn't respond to questions. That silence spoke louder than any denial. By midweek, permits tied to his developments were suddenly under review. Routine, on paper. But timing matters in politics, and everyone knew it. Reporters started connecting dots that hadn't seemed important before. Janae published a follow-up, not accusatory, just meticulous. She laid out the relationships. The overlaps. The sequence of favors that appeared to move faster when certain names were involved. She never said bribery. She didn't need to. The campaign's tone changed again. This time, it was defensive. Short statements. No interviews. Kendall canceled 2 appearances citing family matters. That phrase landed differently now. Tremaine finally called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was careful. He said there was concern about misinterpretation. That cooperation would benefit everyone. That public speculation could cause unnecessary harm. Harm to whom, he didn't say. Renee listened to the voicemail once and deleted it. You don't negotiate while leverage is still forming. Samira checked in quietly that night. She asked how I was holding up, not strategically, but personally. I thought about it before answering. I don't miss him, I said. I miss who I thought he was. That distinction mattered. Because grief can soften resolve if you let it. What steadied me was understanding that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about refusing to let erasure be the cost of someone else's ambition. Kendall had chosen silence when truth would have cost him power. Now silence was costing him credibility. And every day he avoided the spotlight, the shadow around him grew larger, shaped not by accusations, but by unanswered questions he no longer controlled. The subpoena requests didn't come all at once. They trickled in. First, a request for campaign emails related to donor scheduling. Then one for internal calendars. Then communications involving the disclosure amendment. Each one was procedural. Routine. Impossible to argue against without looking defensive. Janae didn't frame it as scandal. She framed it as momentum. Once process starts, she told me, it doesn't care about intentions. Kendall finally broke his silence with a televised statement. He looked thinner. Tired. He spoke about service, about trust, about distractions he regretted. He never said my name. He didn't have to. The anchor followed up with a question about the rally. About the woman he claimed not to know. About whether the separation filing predated the incident. Kendall smiled tightly and said the matter was private. Private again. But by now, that word sounded like avoidance. Renee pulled public court dockets and found the confirmation we'd been waiting for. The separation petition had been drafted weeks before the rally and notarized on a day Kendall was documented at a donor event. That was no longer circumstantial. That was contradiction. Janae requested comment from Tremaine with the docket attached. There was no response. I watched the coverage that night without sound, noticing how the camera lingered just a little longer on Kendall's face than it used to. Control was slipping, not dramatically, but unmistakably. And for the first time, I felt something close to relief. Not because he was falling, but because the truth no longer needed me to carry it alone. Institutions were doing what they always did, slowly, methodically, without emotion. They didn't care who he was married to. They cared whether his story matched the record. And it didn't. The call I'd been expecting came from a number I didn't recognize. Goldcrest's office. Not him. An assistant. Voice tight. Formal. Asking if I would be open to clarifying a few things. Clarifying was their word for containment. I told her no. An hour later, Janae texted me, "He's talking." Not to me. To regulators. That was the moment the story stopped being speculative. By evening, news broke that a preliminary inquiry had been opened into donor influence tied to zoning approvals. No conclusions. No names in the headline. Just confirmation that records were being reviewed. That phrase, being reviewed, changed everything. Kendall canceled the rest of his week. The campaign stopped posting altogether. Silence replaced spin. Renee noticed something else. Donations slowed. Not just to Kendall, but across associated committees. Money doesn't wait when risk appears. Samira asked if I felt vindicated. I didn't. I felt steady. Vindication is loud. It wants applause. What I felt was quieter, like balance returning after standing on uneven ground too long. That night, Kendall emailed me directly. No lawyers. No intermediaries. He asked to meet. Said he wanted to explain. I read it once and archived it. Explanation was what he'd offered the cameras instead of truth. I wasn't interested in hearing it now. Because the story no longer belonged to us as a couple. It belonged to records, timelines, and people with no emotional stake in his success. And that was exactly how it should be. He had erased me to protect his future. Now his future was being examined without him controlling the lens. I didn't need to speak. The truth was finally speaking in a language power understood, and it didn't need my voice to be heard. The campaign tried one last reset. A new spokesperson. A redesigned website. Language about renewed transparency and moving forward together. Kendall reappeared briefly, framed carefully between advisors, answering only pre-approved questions. It didn't land. By now, the audience had changed. Not voters, but auditors. Review boards. People who didn't care about tone. Janae told me regulators had requested additional documents, communications involving Orlando before his resignation. That kind of request doesn't happen unless something upstream already failed to add up. Pressure moved inward. Former staffers started retaining counsel. Calendar entries resurfaced. Emails once dismissed as casual now read differently when aligned with approvals and amendments. Renee mapped it all visually, timelines layered over each other until the overlaps were impossible to ignore. This isn't about one promise, she said. It's about pattern. That night, Kendall's lawyer filed a motion requesting to seal portions of the separation case record, citing ongoing public scrutiny. I laughed for the first time in weeks. He wanted privacy now. I declined to oppose the motion publicly. I didn't need to. The docket already told the story anyone paying attention could read. Samira asked if I felt tempted to say something, to finally put my version on record. I considered it honestly. No, I said. I don't want to be the headline. I'd been erased once by a sentence spoken into a microphone. I wasn't going to reclaim myself by stepping into the same frame. What mattered was that the system was doing what individuals couldn't, asking questions without needing permission, pulling threads without worrying about feelings. Kendall had built his campaign on control. Watching that control slip, not because of me, but because of truth, felt like closure arriving ahead of schedule. I didn't need revenge. I needed distance. And I finally had it. The last move of it didn't come from the campaign. It came from the calendar. Janae called early, her voice steady but alert. "They've scheduled a hearing," she said. "Not public testimony yet. But sworn statements. Closed session." That meant one thing. Stories were about to harden into records. Kendall released a short statement an hour later, announcing he was pausing campaign activities to focus on legal clarification. He framed it as responsibility. As sacrifice. No mention of the inquiry. No mention of Orlando. No mention of donors. And still, no mention of me. I watched the clip once and turned it off. Renee pointed out what mattered more, his language had changed. No more confidence. No more future tense. Everything was conditional now. Careful. People don't speak that way when they're winning. Samira asked if I wanted to attend the hearing. Sit in the back. Be seen. I shook my head. I don't need to be there, I said. They already know I exist. That afternoon, Tremaine emailed again. This time, no posture. No warnings. Just a request for confirmation that I wouldn't engage further with media. I replied with one sentence, "I haven't engaged at all." It was true. And it unsettled them more than anything else I could have said. Because what scared them wasn't my voice. It was the fact that everything they were facing had grown without it. That night, I packed the last of my things from Samira's guest room. Not because I was going back, but because I was moving forward. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that waits patiently while power realizes it's already too late to negotiate with reality. The night before the hearing, I slept without checking my phone. That alone told me how far I'd come. In the morning, the news cycle was already moving. Analysts speculated carefully. Language stayed neutral, but the weight was there. Sworn statements meant consequences. Even without cameras, records last. Janae texted once, "Today locks things in." I didn't reply. Instead, I took a walk along the river, letting the cold air steady me. For weeks, my life had been measured in documents, timestamps, and silences. Today felt different, not lighter, but resolved. Kendall didn't reach out. That absence said more than any apology could have. By afternoon, confirmation came through quietly. Multiple statements taken. Additional document requests issued. No conclusions announced. No declarations made. But the process had teeth now. Renee called and said, "This is the point of no return." She was right. From here on, outcomes wouldn't depend on persuasion or pressure. They'd depend on alignment between what had been said and what could be proven. I thought back to the rally. The sentence that erased me. How small it had sounded, and how large its consequences had become. He'd tried to disappear me to protect his future. Instead, he'd placed himself in the path of something he couldn't spin. That evening, I sat alone in a quiet cafe, watching strangers move through their lives, untouched by mine. The world hadn't ended. It hadn't even paused. And yet, everything had changed. The truth was no longer fragile. It was documented. And tomorrow, it would start standing on its own, without needing me to hold it up. The consequences didn't arrive with headlines. They arrived with absences. Kendall withdrew from the race quietly the morning after the first sworn statements leaked. No press conference. No explanation. Just a short notice posted on the campaign site, thanking supporters for their belief and asking for privacy. Privacy again. I read it once and closed the page. By afternoon, donors began distancing themselves. Statements about changing priorities. Contributions redirected. Photos scrubbed. The machine that had carried him forward reversed direction without apology. Janae called to confirm what the article wouldn't yet say out loud. Regulators had flagged inconsistencies serious enough to expand the inquiry. Subpoenas were no longer requests. They were orders. Kendall's name wasn't splashed across screens, but it was circulating where it mattered. Renee forwarded me a message from a former campaign volunteer, someone I barely remembered, saying they were sorry. That they hadn't known what to do when things felt wrong. I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter. Because I didn't need to be seen anymore. That evening, I returned to the townhouse to collect the last of my belongings. The place felt staged, like a set after filming Wrapped. No flyers. No urgency. Just quiet. I packed slowly. Deliberately. In the bedroom, his suit jacket still hung in the closet. The same one from the rally. I left it there. Walking out for the final time, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. He had erased me publicly to preserve an image. But the truth hadn't needed my presence to dismantle it. All it needed was for me to stop protecting him from what he'd built. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, I understood this wasn't the end of something. It was the return of myself. The legal process moved forward without drama, which somehow made it feel heavier. No courtroom speeches. No grand reversals. Just filings, continuances, and official notices delivered in plain envelopes. The kind that don't trend, but don't disappear either. Tremaine filed a motion to withdraw as Kendall's counsel 2 weeks after the withdrawal announcement. No explanation given. None required. Janae confirmed that regulators were now reviewing donor communications across multiple campaigns, not just his. Patterns rarely stay contained once they're exposed. That part mattered to me more than his personal fallout. Because it meant this wasn't about one man losing power. It was about a system being forced to look at itself. The separation finalized quietly. No contest. No public statements. I signed the last document in a neutral office downtown, handed the pen back, and walked out without looking over my shoulder. There was no sense of loss in that moment. Only relief. Samira met me afterward for coffee. She asked how I felt now that it was official. I thought about it. I feel unattached, I said. In a good way. That night, I boxed up the notebooks I'd kept, not to hide them, but to put them away. Evidence didn't need to sit on my desk anymore. It had done its work. I didn't follow the inquiry closely after that. I didn't need to. The outcome no longer defined me. What defined me was the quiet that returned when I stopped being managed, explained, or erased. I slept through the night again. And in the morning, when I looked at my life without his name attached to it, it finally felt like mine, unfiltered, unedited, and intact. The world didn't rush to fill the space he left behind. At first, that felt strange. Mornings were quieter. Evenings stretched longer. There were no campaign schedules taped to the fridge, no constant hum of urgency vibrating through the house I now lived in alone. I moved into a smaller apartment across town, nothing dramatic. Clean lines. Big windows. A place that didn't carry anyone else's ambition in its walls. I donated most of what I didn't need. Clothes I'd worn to events that were never meant for me. Shoes chosen for appearances instead of comfort. Letting go felt practical, not symbolic. One afternoon, I ran into someone who recognized me, not from the rally, but from the coverage that followed. She hesitated before speaking, unsure if she should say anything. I just wanted to tell you, she said finally, that what you did mattered. I thanked her and kept walking. Validation from strangers landed softly now. It didn't define me the way it might have before. I wasn't trying to be understood by everyone. What mattered more were the small shifts. I stopped checking the news before bed. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. When Kendall's name surfaced occasionally, attached to an update or a headline, I noticed without reacting. That neutrality surprised me. It felt earned. Renee once asked if I regretted not speaking publicly, not giving interviews, not reclaiming the narrative in my own voice. No, I said. I reclaimed myself instead. That choice gave me something no apology ever could. Peace without permission. As weeks passed, the story faded from public view, replaced by newer controversies and louder scandals. That's how it always goes. But inside me, something had settled permanently. I was no longer the woman someone could deny knowing. I was the woman who knew exactly who she was, and didn't need an audience to prove it. The inquiry concluded without ceremony. No dramatic announcement. No televised reckoning. Just a notice posted quietly on a government site, confirming findings of ethical violations and failures of disclosure, followed by referrals for administrative review. Kendall's name appeared once in the summary. No photograph. No quote. That restraint felt intentional. Power rarely collapses loudly. It dissolves. Janae sent me the link with a single line, "This is as final as it gets." I read the report slowly, not for vindication, but for closure. The language was precise. Measured. It confirmed what I already knew without saying anything I needed to hear. I closed the document and didn't save it. That afternoon, I met Samira for a walk along the river. We talked about work. Travel. Ordinary plans that didn't orbit around someone else's crisis. At one point she asked, "Do you ever wonder what he thinks now?" I considered it honestly. No, I said. That used to matter to me. It doesn't anymore. What mattered was how my life felt when it wasn't shaped by reaction. I enrolled in a program I'd postponed for years, something I'd talked myself out of when everything revolved around timing and optics. The first day, sitting in a classroom full of strangers, I felt light. Anonymous in the best way. No one knew my story. I didn't need them to. That night, alone in my apartment, I cooked dinner slowly, without checking my phone or rushing toward the next obligation. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something I needed to manage. It felt open. And as I turned off the lights and let the quiet settle, I understood the final truth of it all. He had tried to erase me to secure his legacy. Instead, he gave me the freedom to build my own. The last message from Kendall arrived months later. No subject line. Just a few sentences that felt carefully weighed and strangely empty. He said he hoped I was doing well. That he was reflecting. That he regretted how things had unfolded. He didn't apologize. Not really. There was no acknowledgement of the cameras. No mention of the sentence that had erased me. No ownership of the choices that followed. I read it once and closed the laptop. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel tempted to respond. What I felt was distance, the kind that comes from no longer standing in the same emotional weather as someone else. That afternoon, I deleted the email. Not dramatically. Not as a statement. Just because it no longer belonged in my life. I spent the rest of the day reorganizing my space. Hanging art I liked instead of art that looked appropriate. Moving my desk closer to the window. Small decisions that felt personal instead of strategic. In the evening, Renee called to tell me she was taking a new role in another city. We talked about logistics, not history. Funny how things shift, she said. When you stop bracing. She was right. I realized that the tension I'd carried for years, the quiet vigilance, the need to be ready, had drained away without my noticing. I wasn't guarding anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next development or statement or explanation. The story had ended where it needed to. Not with his understanding. But with my peace. As the sun dipped below the buildings outside my window, I sat with that feeling and let it stay. I didn't need closure from him. I had already given it to myself. A few weeks later, I ran into Janae by chance. Not at a press event or a courthouse, just a quiet bookstore downtown. She recognized me first and smiled like we were old colleagues instead of people bound by a story that no longer needed telling. We talked between shelves, our voices low out of habit. The file's officially closed, she said. No further action. I nodded. I hadn't been waiting for that confirmation, but hearing it still felt like a door clicking shut somewhere behind me. She hesitated, then added, "You know, a lot of people expected you to want credit." "I never wanted credit," I said. "I wanted accuracy." She smiled at that. "You got it." After she left, I wandered the store longer than I planned to. I picked up books I'd once set aside, things that didn't fit into campaign optics or busy schedules. I bought two without overthinking it. That night, I sat on my floor with the windows open, city sounds drifting in, and read until my eyes grew tired. No alerts. No updates. No urgency. It struck me then how different my attention felt. Before, my focus had always been outward, anticipating reactions, smoothing edges, preparing explanations. Now it rested easily where I placed it. On myself. I wasn't rebuilding anything. I was inhabiting what had always been there, waiting for room. The woman Kendall denied knowing had been reduced to a moment on camera. But the woman I was now existed in hours, in choices, in silence that belonged to me. As I turned the last page and closed the book, I realized something simple and grounding. I hadn't just survived being erased. I had outgrown the version of my life that made erasure possible at all. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly, and without weight. I was updating paperwork at work one afternoon when I noticed the name change reflected everywhere: email, internal directories, old permissions quietly expiring. Systems moved on efficiently once told to. No one asked questions. That, too, felt like progress. Later that week, I received a forwarded article from Samira. Not about Kendall. About campaign finance reform proposals gaining traction in the state legislature. Broader conversations sparked by several unrelated inquiries. "Your ripple," she wrote beneath the link. I didn't correct her. Ripples don't belong to anyone once they spread. What mattered was that the narrative I'd been trapped inside no longer followed me into rooms. I wasn't the woman from the rally. I wasn't a footnote in someone else's ambition. I was just myself again. One evening, while cooking dinner, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. Relaxed posture. Unrushed movements. A face that no longer carried the need to be read correctly. That was new. I hadn't realized how much of my identity had been spent managing perception, mine, his, everyone else's. Letting go of that felt like setting down something heavy I'd carried so long I forgot it wasn't part of me. The past didn't disappear. It settled into context. A chapter, not a definition. As I turned off the stove and sat down to eat, I thought about the sentence that started all of this, the one spoken into a microphone, meant to erase me. It no longer held power. Words only last when we keep repeating them. I had stopped. And in the quiet that followed, I understood that the most complete form of justice isn't punishment. It's freedom. I didn't mark the anniversary of the rally. It passed without ceremony, unnoticed until the date showed up briefly on my calendar before I deleted it. That felt right. Instead, I marked smaller things. The first time I laughed without restraint. The first weekend I made plans without checking anyone else's schedule. The first time a decision belonged entirely to me, start to finish. Those moments didn't announce themselves. They accumulated quietly. One afternoon, I donated the last box of campaign-related materials I'd kept: binders, notebooks, folders that once felt urgent. I watched the volunteer seal the box and slide it onto a shelf, indistinguishable from dozens of others. That anonymity felt like relief. On the walk home, I realized I no longer felt the need to explain my past to justify my present. People accepted me as I was. I accepted myself the same way. Samira noticed it too. "You're lighter," she said one night over dinner. Not happier exactly. Just settled. She was right. Happiness can be loud. Settled is quiet and stable. It doesn't ask for witnesses. I thought about Kendall less often now, not with anger or sadness, but with distance. Like remembering a former job that once consumed your life and now feels strangely unreal. It wasn't that I'd forgiven him. I'd released him. There's a difference. Forgiveness still keeps the story alive. Release lets it end. That evening, as I closed the blinds and turned off the lights, I felt something firm beneath the calm. Confidence. Not the kind built on being chosen or recognized. The kind that comes from knowing you will never again make yourself small to fit someone else's ambition. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and unshakable. And I understood then that my future didn't need protection. It needed presence. And I was finally fully here. The last thread tying me to that chapter loosened without effort. I received a notice confirming the final administrative outcomes, brief, factual, impersonal. No action required. No response needed. Just confirmation that the process had concluded. I read it once and filed it away. Not because I needed it. Because I was finished organizing my past. That afternoon, I walked through my neighborhood slowly, noticing details I'd ignored before. The sound of someone practicing piano through an open window. A dog pulling its owner toward a patch of sunlight. Ordinary life, uninterrupted. I realized how long I'd lived in reaction, anticipating someone else's needs, smoothing edges, adjusting myself to fit a moving target. That instinct was gone now. In its place was something steadier. Choice. I chose where to spend my time. Who to answer. What mattered enough to carry forward. That evening, I cooked a meal for myself and ate it at the table instead of the counter, without distraction. I didn't rush. I didn't plan ahead. I let the moment be sufficient. There was no urge to look backward. No need to wonder how things might have been different. I had learned something lasting, not about politics or ambition, but about myself. That dignity doesn't come from being acknowledged. It comes from refusing to accept erasure as the price of love. As I cleared the dishes and turned off the lights, I felt a calm certainty settle in. Nothing had been taken from me. Something had been returned. And this time, it was mine to keep. I don't tell the story often anymore. Not because it hurts, but because it no longer defines the shape of my days. When people ask about that period of my life, I answer simply. I don't dramatize it. I don't minimize it either. I speak with the same calm I use for anything that's already settled. It surprises them sometimes. They expect anger. Or pride. Or a sharper edge. What they don't expect is peace. On a quiet evening, months after everything ended, I stood by my window and watched the city lights come on one by one. Each apartment lit from the inside by someone else's life continuing, unchanged by mine. That used to scare me, the idea of being unseen. Now, it comforts me. Because visibility was never the same as value. And silence was never the same as weakness. I thought back to the moment on the courthouse steps, the sentence meant to erase me in front of everyone. I don't know her. He said it like it was final. But erasure only works when you agree to disappear. I hadn't. I'd stayed. Quietly. Fully. Long enough for the truth to stand without me holding it up. I didn't rebuild my life out of spite. I didn't move forward to prove anything. I moved forward because I was done carrying a story that was never mine to protect. As I turned away from the window and let the night settle in, I felt something solid and lasting take root. Not closure. Control. My name no longer needed to be spoken by anyone else to exist. I knew who I was. And this time, no one could deny it. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.